Cool. Well, we're just going to get started. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. Can you hear me okay, or is this an okay volume? All right, cool, thank you. So my name is Daigle, Orians. I am the visual arts manager here at Real Artways, and it's been an utmost pleasure to work with Julian on this exhibition. Julian is one of 6 artists that were selected through a free open call open to New England, New York, and New Jersey artists we call the Real Art Awards. Last year, he was one of 6 to be chosen out of a field of almost 500 applicants. So really exciting, very grateful to have him here too, that he happened to come here and see the sign and be like, oh, I should apply to that. That was pretty cool, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
And we are actually currently now going through our 3rd cycle, and we are accepting applications. So I've made sure to tell Julian to tell all of his friends, as well as anybody who happens to maybe see this video on the internet. So Julian and I have been working on this exhibition ever since he got chosen by our jurors. And it's been a really fun process, and I just kind of wanted to start talking in general about your work. So this exhibition in particular explores a very personal narrative surrounding your experience with Marfan syndrome, mental health, and religion. So what kind of led you to working within a personal narrative?
Well, it was kind of a process for me to even figure out how I wanted the project to go. Because originally I started focusing on chronic pain as a subject matter because I was going through, originally I was diagnosed with Marfan syndrome when I was 5. And so different symptoms started developing. I had to wear a back brace for 10 years. I had a spinal fusion when I was 15, jaw surgery when I was 18. Went on and off a bunch of different medication for pain and mental health. And I was at a point in college where I threw out my back I was a sound engineer. I did all the sound for the concerts and everything. And I threw up my back carrying equipment, and I was just at a huge low point. And whenever I would try to coordinate with professors too, I felt like I could. And whenever anyone would look at me, they would be like, "Oh, you look fine. You seem like a tall, strapping, healthy person." But I got to a point where I felt like it was hard to just verbally explain how everything was going. And I also realized that within the medium of photography, coverage of Marfan syndrome has largely just been medical, just hospital photographs, looking kind of objectifying and dehumanizing the body a bit. And the only photographs depicting Marfan syndrome that existed that kind of subverted that were by photographers without it. One was a fashion photographer that was oh, we're gonna focus on the inner beauty, and it kind of just skirted around the whole thing.
Oh, sure.
And it was okay. And then another one was focusing on children growing up with rare genetic disorders and conditions. But again, with someone that didn't really have a firsthand experience.
That's super interesting that you say that, because I remember when we were talking, you had mentioned that there are so many actors in horror films who typically portray monsters. The actor who portrayed the monster from The Shape of Water is somebody with Marfan syndrome, and he is often cast in these roles because he can bend and he can do weird stuff with his body. And so there's something really interesting about that kind of outside gaze, that outside thinking about the monsterhood, or this creature rather than a human. And so it sounds to me you're kind of getting at this idea of humanizing and personalizing. Is that accurate? Is that
yeah, that's 100%. Because also too, I would when I'd be in situations where I'd be I don't really know what to do. If doctors were making it difficult to navigate things, or I was just looking for some sort of if someone had gone down a similar path to find some sort of inspiration or guidance, but I would Google Marfan syndrome when it was all just spooky creatures, and then if you go to top 10 most famous people with Marfans, it was Osama bin Laden maybe, or Abraham Lincoln, just kind of irrelevant and
weird.
Yeah, and so it was nothing. Google couldn't find what I was looking for, so I just felt I just wanted to try to make something that I was hoping that existed, something that kind of expressed. And that's why it became such a personal narrative, because I felt I also went through a process of, when I first started this project, I would meet a lot of different people with different conditions and relate to them on the basis of chronic pain. And some of this portrait here of my friend Cece from family friend from childhood, Deanna in Shanghai back there, they all had various conditions, but I realized that they ended up being more like portraits from like a newspaper article about the person rather than like a whole cohesive thing. So I just felt like if I wanted to make a project, I should just make it about myself.
Hence why your body repeatedly shows up in some of these images too, because it makes sense. It's a personal narrative. It should have your personal feature. And so I think, talking about that too, we use the word narrative to talk about your work, and that was something that kind of came up very early in our conversations. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the structure of this exhibition and the way that we ultimately chose to kind of hang the photos as opposed to being one straight line. There are photos of varying heights on the wall. There's even one with the leg. That's my favorite photo, the leg's so close to the ground. It's only my favorite because it's down there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like that word narrative and like the idea of trying to tell a story through your images.
That's a great question. I feel like a lot of my experience, there's no like linear narrative. There's not really any clear progression. I mean, there is, but in a lot of trying to recreate or retell certain experiences, it felt fairly abstract and kind of placelessness and timelessness, because it was something that I've been like thinking about my whole life. So the narrative, it does tell a bit of a progression, and I try to sequence it in a way where you slowly are introduced to certain symptoms and certain things about living with Marfan syndrome, but a lot of it just became visual sequences and cues between like gestural things, and with this placing of it's very, it's not very symmetrical, it's very elongated and kind of distorted, and we thought that form meets content kind of there.
Yeah, and then I think in talking about the narrative and the structure of it, I think my favorite moment is on this wall right here that I'm pointing to with the crucifix and then you on your bed and then the doctor, and it's all of this very T-pose crucify moment that just kind of points to all these things. And then even one more further, we see the X-rays of the spine. Yeah, and I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about how religion plays a role in this work. You've got a lot of different imagery, both the crucifix, but then there's also the prayer candle, and some other moments that speak towards religion, and how that ties into Marfan syndrome, or at least your experience with Marfan syndrome.
So I grew up in a Catholic family in Texas, so it was pretty like, all right, go to church every Sunday situation. And as it's because it's a genetic condition. Other people in my family have Marfan syndrome too, and their whole approach to dealing with it was like, like the God's in charge. Like it's like an existential weight taken off yourself when living with something that's just like the doctors don't really have answers. There's not like a cure for it. So a lot of my anxiety surrounding it was kind of lifted off growing up, because I was very happy-go-lucky growing up, and kind of people would like pull me aside and be like, it's so beautiful that you're just so smiley going through all this. And I was like,
so
I'm 8 and trying to play soccer. I don't know. But as I got older, I didn't end up getting confirmed at the Catholic Church, and I stopped going and kind of only do it more now for family reasons. And now that I also noticed too that like once that facet of my life started fading, more of the mental health things started creeping in, and a lot of how I view myself and like my struggles all come from that kind of like Catholic perspective a little bit. And I think, even though I'm not as religious as I grew up, it still kind of relates to how I view my whole experience with everything.
Sure, yeah. And like personal note, that was actually something that I connected with on you very early on. Very different reasons though, but we both had like similar experiences within the church. And so there's this weird moment of like, oh my God, we see each other.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of my favorite parts about working with here, is being able to work one-on-one with artists and understand their practice and just like kind of connect with them, even though experiences are so different, work is so different. But like just being able to connect on that moment was really beautiful, which is another reason why I'm happy you applied. So kind of jumping around my questions I gave you earlier, I kind of wanted to talk about the actual process of making these images, because we talked a little bit about the installation and all of that. So to me, your work kind of falls somewhere between setup scenarios and like very candid photographs of just moments you happen upon. So I'm curious for you to talk a little bit more about your process in creating an image and like what your editing process looks like too, because I'm sure you have thousands of photographs of each one of these, or at least like multiple to choose from, and you have to choose like one. So yeah.
My process for this, I actually felt a lot slower than normal. I tend to kind of run around and shoot a lot. But this, I felt like everything needed to be so particular. And kind of it ended up being half and half, like half stage, half documentary, more or less. But there's constructed elements to all of it. But a lot of it, I mean, it was either like this is the X-ray that needed to be there just to have a visual depiction of what it looked like. I started being like, I need a couple religious things here. I need a few portraits. It all kind of, I thought of it as a whole the whole time I was making it, because I had such a hope that it would be a more cohesive, holistic story. But it just it flowed as it went along. Some like this photo here with everyone leaning down and me kind of bending over, I just had that thought in the shower, like I need to have some sort of visual expression of that. But I think that the process was very indicative of the fact that I just shoot like a diary and kind of wanted to make the whole thing just be a personal daily thing. And then I curated it all after the fact kind of thing, just let it happen.
You like basically knew that you had certain dots, certain moments that you wanted, and then you decided to make those dots and then connect them afterwards.
Yeah, it felt like I was almost like a sort of detective of my own memory. Sort of like, and there's even with my medical records, the actual physical element of me bringing twine around to different documents and X-rays.
Yeah, I love that image in particular too, because it feels like madman conspiracy theorist. And then directly across from it, the last image in the exhibition are your medical bills on a roof. And it has a very similar quality of this paper being jumbled all together, but they're very different results. You have the chaos, but organized chaos of the corkboard, and then you have you just threw them up there and let the rain soak on them. And speaking of like medical records, the X-ray, these photographs kind of evoke a very intense feeling of intimacy, not only with the repeated image of yourself in them, but also just kind of the X-ray, the medical records, all these other things. There's something very intimate about these images. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering what role vulnerability kind of plays in these images specifically.
Vulnerability was a huge factor in it. I mean, personally, I'm more of like a fairly introverted, shy person, and so that's what attracted me to being a photographer to begin with, is you can kind of be like a fly on the wall, float through scenes.
Hide behind the lens.
But then the moment I just like rotated the camera around to myself, I was like, oh man, I hope this goes well. But I mean, I felt like if I was going to do this project, I needed to do it justice, and I wanted to be as honest and open as possible. And I mean, dealing with self-harm and like surgeries and different types of recoveries, I felt like if I was gonna do it, I wasn't gonna do it. Like
you have to fully commit to it.
You have to fully commit to it. And it's like about my faith, body, and brain. So I feel like that's kind of the most vulnerable things that you can get.
Sure, and earlier you referenced talking about your work as like a diary. You're taking a diary, and there's something about I feel like there are two ways that you can go about writing a diary. There's the one where it's actually just to yourself, and then there's the other one where you're like, maybe this will get published one day, where you're like kind of writing your story to like almost like entertain the reader, even though the reader is realistically just you. So there's some kind of like tension there too, because on one hand you are an artist, you are creating these images to be seen, but on the other hand you're trying to continue to be vulnerable and authentic. And so like as a result, some of these become kind of theatrical. I mean, there's also the smoke coming out of the cave. There's nothing more theatrical than that. But then you have other moments like this golden light behind me that like I highly doubt you staged. That's probably something you just saw.
Yeah.
And you're just like, click, gotta have it. So I think there's this really interesting tension in that as well. And speaking of, that has actually nothing to do with the next question. Speaking of segues, so these images were taken in a variety of locations. Something that actually I feel the viewer doesn't necessarily know until they read the titles, and the titles include location. Ranging from Connecticut to New York, but also to your home of Texas and even China. Yet in spite of that, like the images are kind of cohesive. To the point where even this doctor leaning back right there, I didn't realize that was in China until I read the title and saw, oh yeah, there's some characters in there that point towards it being a Chinese building that he's in. Mm-hmm. So how does place function in your work?
I think place, it unites in a way because I guess it's all aesthetically shot in similar ways, but place, I mean, I was looking for different things in different places that I went to. I went to China to work on photography, but also to go see a lot of different doctors there and get acupuncture and, moxibustion, fire cupping, different kinds of treatment, because in America, the options are just like Advil and another surgery.
That's the title of your next show.
Advil and another surgery.
You're welcome.
Exactly. Thank you very much. But yeah, it's also relates to it just being a diary. Is I didn't want to stop shooting if I was like in a different place or a different country, and I wanted people to go along with me. And I ended up learning different things in different places. And I mean, travel allowed me to go to like the Marfan Foundation headquarters, which ended up being a very like bizarrely clinical and like corporate environment. I think the picture is somewhere. Right here, this one right here.
Oh, the hearts on the wall.
Yeah.
For those of you who can't see, it's like a boardroom, and it's hearts on the wall, like these photographs of hearts that are like seemingly constructed out of other things.
Yeah.
That's the Marfan syndrome?
That's the Marfan Foundation conference room where they make all their big decisions.
Huh.
But yeah, I mean, it was a process of me traveling around to find things, but also to figure out what I was looking for and also learn more a bit about myself.
That's really interesting. And earlier you also had mentioned this idea of creating this feeling where place is almost illegible because that's kind of where you were feeling in your head. And I feel like this kind of plays with that and that it goes there in a really interesting way. So there's this thing that we talked about a lot in creating this exhibition where we wanted to create a space. You wanted to create a space, rather. And we talked about different options to that, building a false wall and creating a projection, and doing some other things with video. But ultimately, we kind of decided on having this bench in the center of the room with a pair of headphones that are connected to an MP3 player. So there is a sound element to this room. And I wanted to take a moment to like listen to some of it while we look at some of the art. And then afterwards, I want to talk about what your feelings are in terms of the sound component and our ultimate choice to have it headphones as opposed to environmental. And we get to actually experience it environmentally now, which is pretty exciting. Yeah, and then kind of thoughts about that and like how you imagine exploring that more in the future.
Lord Jesus, I come before you just as I am. I am sorry for my sins. I repent of my sins. Please forgive me. In your name, I forgive all others for what they have done against me. I renounce Satan, the evil spirits, and all their works.
The three layers of sound in this are one. What you were mentioning earlier about actors playing a lot of horror characters in horror films. The kind of eerie sound that's a sample from a motion test for the movie Mama.
Right.
With Javier Botet, who has Marfan syndrome. He was the horror villain in that. And I found that on YouTube when I was trying to do more research. And layered it with drum sounds and also like a distorted sound of a clergy doing like a final prayer at church. And I guess thinking about, with the sound piece, I really wanted to kind of depict some sort of like existential religious struggle. And I feel like the placelessness of it all too plays into just essentially feeling estranged from your body, feeling like you might not feel comfortable in your own body, wandering around, not feeling at home in any particular place, all kind of played into the themes of the project. And I think the sound piece tied it in a way where you see everything visually, but then you get a little snippet of just like some internal conflict going on that doesn't seem to be resolved in any way.
Sure, yeah, and I feel like, we had gone back and forth as to whether or not this should be through speakers or headphones, and I feel talking about intimacy, talking about this idea of connecting with vulnerability, it almost makes more sense for it to be headphones.
Yeah.
To like allow the individual to kind of go through that experience themselves and to kind of like be disconnected from the world around them for a moment through the headphones, through this experience that nobody else is experiencing with them. I think there's something really interesting about that. It's like reading a diary. It's like you're reading something so personal and so intimate, but the people around you aren't reading with you, so they aren't doing that with you. So interesting.
Yeah.
So where do you imagine kind of exploring new media a little bit more in the future? We talked about that that screen test from Mama, and how you had thought about like kind of reinterpreting it with your own body. I'm just curious, are you still considering other aspects like video, like doing those kinds of things?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I feel like I'm so young, and I have so much more time to explore different things. But video is something I really want to. It's a great extension over from photography. And I showed you a GIF that I made that we're thinking about including too of video and movement. And I mean, I've taken a couple dance classes in college, and I find that people have told other choreographers and stuff like that have been like, oh, you have a very unique body. Like, I mean, you got to work with it at some point. But I feel like I'm definitely in a position where I want to experiment with film and movement. And I mean, I made my first painting like a month ago. I'm definitely trying to branch out and explore all the possibilities. Definitely working with sound more.
Sure.
Trying to record more stuff, maybe more soundscapes, more collages. We don't really know.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart kind of choice to go forward. Some of these photographs kind of, especially the more set up ones, there's one photograph that you wanted to show that I actually said no to. It was the shrine that you had made. And literally the only reason why I argued against it was that it was vertical. And everything else has this like beautiful horizontal stretchy longness that having that one vertical would make it stand out in all the wrong reasons, even though it was a beautiful image of this shrine that you've created. So like there are elements of this like collaging nature, even the cork board, the roof with your things on it. You're already kind of thinking about collage in a very straight up photographic manner. So now it's just kind of like a matter of taking another step and just seeing where it goes. And I think just in what we talked about, I was really excited about the idea of having video as a part of this show, but we both agreed, like, you're so new to it. You're so new to like exploring it that you haven't really found your voice like you have found your voice behind a still camera. So with that in mind, the final question I have on my lovely sheet before we open it up to the audience, what's next for Julian Johnson?
Well, again, just exploring different mediums. I mean, I'm working on a new photo project right now. The working title of it is Greatest Environmental Concern, because I've always grown up interested in environmental issues. And one of my odd jobs after college was working as a canvasser, fundraising on the street for the Nature Conservancy. And I would always have to like heckle people and get them to stop and try to scam them out of their credit card.
Oh, yeah. As one does.
As one does.
College.
Yeah, you're just trying to make it. But my question I would ask everyone is, what's your greatest environmental concern? And I always feel like it's ended up turning out a very like similar diary process of like exploring my own relationship to environmental issues around me, different moments that have like heavy in pollution, the labor behind the infrastructure of sustainability, or the lack thereof. So I'm working on that, working on definitely extending this project too, because I think it's definitely going to be a lifelong journey.
Sure.
And there's going to be more things that pop up that I feel like will need to be captured somehow. So more music too. I mean, I play the drum. We're both musicians. We've chatted about this. So lots more music, lots more sound.
Just trying to stretch every single
Literally,
creative muscle in your body.
Anything I can do, I'll do it.
Proud of you, Julian.
Thank you.
So at this point, this is a good time to open it up for some questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question about Julian, his work, all that fun stuff, this will be a good time for that. Yeah, go for it.
Well, my first question is, why did you decide the size of these images?
Ooh, we had a great conversation about that. Go for it.
Well, there's two ways to answer that. One was my camera ended up not shooting high enough resolution to really print much larger without it getting very pixelated, so I was hoping that the presentation of the photos stayed intact. But a huge reason why I wanted to present it this small is because it feels like it needs to belong in a book or somewhere more secret and like intimate and private. So I thought small and having the viewer have to go close up to find, especially like the smaller details in the photo, was very important for me. And even having it unframed without glass or anything barring the viewer from being up close and personal to it.
Yeah, because we had talked about exactly that. Like, if I had a magazine in my lap, it would be about the size of these images. Yeah, that was a great conversation. I love that. Yeah. You had a second question?
I was going to ask you how you shot them. Did they film?
No, people always ask me, is it film? It's a digital camera. I shoot with a Sony A7, the first generation. But I think the photos have a quality to them where the focus is actually broken on my camera, so I have to focus it like it's a film camera and kind of set it up in a very like still perfect way, because oftentimes it comes out super blurry or glitchy. I should just fix my camera, but it also
Perhaps get a new one.
but it definitely slowed down the process a lot more and made me a little bit more thoughtful with what I was doing. So
Good problems.
good problems. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about kind of what were the harder elements when you're trying to showcase this like very personal narrative that isn't not something that the average person can relate to? What were kind of stuff that you were grappling with, whether that's, I don't know, like exposing even yourself to more like mental health related issues that you might have, or just literally figuring out which image reflects a feeling that you were trying to showcase? Like, what were kind of the harder parts of building this story?
That's a great. I mean, it all felt kind of difficult. It still feels incomplete to me because I feel like anything that I do doesn't really totally capture what will happen. And one issue I've had with showing this work, not just here but also at Wesleyan, was so many people would walk through and they'd be like, "You're really interested in medical like imagery. What's the story there?" And like completely missed that it was kind of an autobiographical story. So I feel like it's hard. I still struggle with that, trying to invite people in as much as I can so they can relate to it or get a better look into it. I feel like I'm past the point where exposing myself will cause further mental health issues or make it difficult to be vulnerable, because I feel like I'm already checked in and zoned in to try to make this work seen.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't really have an answer to that. It's still difficult. I hope it's curated in a way where it's accessible, but
We do what we can.
we do what we can.
Any other thoughts? Go ahead. This is a quiet, intimate.
I'm curious about, I'm thinking, like, why didn't you choose to put any of your family in if they have this very strong connection to your family and your siblings having fun? Thinking you said your siblings is genetic?
There are some people in my family that have it. The genetics of it makes it like my brother doesn't have it, but my mom and my aunt has it. My cousin actually is that's her ankle. So the photo low on the ground, like she was out one night and she just slipped in a bathroom and then just broke her ankle because it's very easy for injuries to happen. And that was a photo of her during her recovery of that process. I did photograph my mom for this, and it felt wrong. She doesn't like to sit in front of the camera. A lot of my family is really shy about being photographed too, is an issue. And I wasn't home long enough to really spend time with them and be able to produce work. But that's definitely a direction that I want to go with the project, is incorporating my family more. And hopefully finding more people with Marfan syndrome. Because I couldn't, with my whole process trying to find other patients that had chronic pain issues, I couldn't find a Marfan's patient outside of my family.
And maybe that's where like working more digitally with audio and video, that can help you bridge the distance, the literal distance between you and your family.
Yeah, exactly. That is a photo of an organization called Power for Parkinsons, which is run by, actually my friend's mother is the director of that. But that's a movement group at a church in Austin, doing movement and exercise to help fight a lot of the symptoms of Parkinson's. And I shot this in relationship to the work because I interviewed a lot of the people in that foundation and photographed them in their homes, learning more about how they deal with their own types of chronic pain. I met one woman who was in that group that had, I want to say, like 5 back surgeries throughout her life, just repairing certain vertebra and things like that. But yeah, Parkinson's is a huge thing that a lot of people deal with.
Would you say you were able to find, because you talked about trying to find somebody with Marfan's through this chronic pain, and you weren't able to do that. When I first saw this image, not really knowing that connection, I just kind of see this one gentleman kind of struggling to get up, and there's some hunching and all that stuff. And it's not necessarily, oh, I connected this to Marfan, but I definitely connect it with your own story. Did you feel like any kind of connection in terms of mobility, in terms of pain, all that fun stuff?
Yeah, I feel like it might be odd for me to say this as like a 23-year-old, but me and a lot of people in that organization had similar stories of being like, oh, the bed in the morning sucks, and like you wake up and like, why does my neck hurt now, and my right leg is numb, and all these. Sure. It's funny because pain is universal, and even if like the symptoms and conditions are different, and it hits you at a different time in your life or any other sort of difference, it kind of unites with pain. And I found that allowed me to access a lot of different people and make connections with people in ways that I didn't really think existed before this project. This project, too, was largely, I felt so alone and didn't really know anyone else that was struggling with something medically, and this was me just being like, I'm going to be proactive and find people that just can relate, at least in some way.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
What's the idea behind the trees?
The trees. This was a found moment in Austin, and just the way that the fence kind of like is built around the tree, and kind of like, it's almost as if like it's not acknowledging that the tree is there.
Sure.
But the visual of those trees getting compressed in that way kind of reminded me of the before and after spine surgeries. And I was thinking about growing up, that was the feeling of wearing a back brace every day, of having like being wrapped around and having plastic and metal just kind of like shove your ribs in so your spine stops growing like a snake. But it just kind of reminded me of a lot of those moments.
Yeah, interesting. Any other thoughts? One more?
I spoke with you earlier that I'm working on a project of old family photographs. I was wondering if you thought about putting in any old images of when you were younger when this began for you.
I did find a few childhood photos where it's funny too, because it's a Milwaukee. There's 2 different types of braces. There's a Milwaukee brace and a Boston brace. But when I was younger, I wore a brace that like went all the way over my shoulders, so you could see me as a smiley kid with like a couple missing teeth, with like a little hunch over. So I did find a lot of childhood photographs, and a lot of when I went to my dentist recently. one of the technicians was like, yeah, I was at a meeting and we were going through your old photos because I was going to the same dentist since I was 5, and I've had like braces 3 different times, jaw surgery, impacted teeth, different ways that my palate grew incorrectly due to Marfan syndrome. And I just had like, she sent me all the JPEGs
Nice.
of all the, from when I was like 5 to like 18, but all the ways that my teeth grew out weird and like, so yeah, definitely I found a ton of childhood photos and more medical images of me as a child growing up. And I'd love to incorporate them in a way, but it felt, at least within what the work I have here, it felt like it was tough to connect both.
Sure.
Maybe it could work in a book or something, but.
Yeah, I would love to see your work in a book, and I would keep that book on my coffee table for sure. Awesome. Well,
I appreciate that.
but I'm gonna get a free copy.
Exactly.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. We're still going to be sticking around for a little bit, so if you want to ask Julian some more questions, feel free. I'm volunteering you for that.
Yes.
So thank you again so much for coming to Real Art Ways. I really appreciated it. It means a lot when people come to these things. So thank you.
Thank you.